I had always cherished the mornings at my mountain cabin, the way the sun spilled over the peaks, painting the pines in golden light. There was a profound stillness here, a rhythm to the air itself that seemed to slow time. I would step out onto the deck with a cup of coffee, inhale the crisp mountain breeze, and feel a sense of belonging that no city street or manicured lawn could ever provide. This cabin wasn't just a structure. It was the culmination of years of dreams, of quiet labor, of memories stitched into every beam and nail. Each board told a story, each window framed a chapter of solitude, reflection, and sometimes healing. And in those moments, standing alone amid the mountains, it felt as though the world outside, the noise, the deadlines, the pressures, simply didn't exist. Then, without warning, that fragile serenity shattered. A deep, mechanical growl echoed through the valley, rolling across the hillside like an intruder into a sacred space. At first, I thought it might be construction on a nearby road, but the sound grew closer, heavier, unmistakably deliberate. I squinted toward the entrance of the private road leading up to my property. I saw the unmistakable shape of a bulldozer perched on a flatbed trailer, accompanied by 3 trucks charging forward. The air seemed to thicken, and my chest tightened with disbelief and rising alarm. Who would come here? Why now? And more importantly, by what authority would anyone think they could simply march in and destroy a home that had been built with care, love, and patience? The enormity of the moment sank in. This wasn't a routine inspection or neighborly complaint. Something far more audacious, far more deliberate was unfolding. And in that instant, standing amid the quiet grandeur of the mountains I had claimed as mine, I understood that what lay ahead would challenge not only the cabin, but the very sense of ownership, control, and justice I had always taken for granted. The trucks came to a halt just past the bend of the private road, their engines hissing and rumbling, the metal gleaming under the morning sun. The flatbed carried a bulldozer that looked far too heavy and far too purposeful to belong to any casual construction crew. Men in hard hats and reflective vests disembarked, carrying clipboards and what appeared to be official documentation. At first glance, it seemed formal, organized, almost professional, but something in the way they moved, the stiffness in their posture, hinted at a rehearsed performance rather than genuine authority. I approached cautiously, heart-hammering, eyes scanning the papers they brandished. The logos were vaguely familiar, but wrong in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The typography uneven, the seals blurred, the letterhead strangely generic. It didn't add up. Something about this made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight. "Good morning," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, though adrenaline tightened my throat. "May I see your permits?" The foreman, a thick-set man with a clipboard, blinked at me as if my question were a nuisance rather than an expectation. "Emergency demolition order," he said, voice clipped and mechanical, handing over the papers. I took them slowly, examining every line, every stamp, every official-looking emblem. Nothing made sense. The agency name did not exist. The document felt manufactured, hastily printed on low-quality paper, and the seal was a crude imitation of government insignia. I swallowed the rising panic and the disbelief. Why would anyone risk this? Risk illegal action on private property with such glaring mistakes? I stepped closer, lowering my voice, forcing calm over the storm of outrage rising inside me. "Do you even know who I am?" I asked, letting the weight of my presence linger in the air. "This house is private property. You cannot just come in here under a fake authority and attempt to tear it down." The foreman hesitated, glancing at his crew, who shuffled uncomfortably. His eyes darted back to me, calculating, weighing options. I noticed the tiniest flicker of uncertainty. Even in their armor of uniform vests and hard hats, I could see cracks. Authority is a fragile thing when confronted by someone unwilling to be intimidated, someone willing to ask the right questions. Then it struck me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. The audacity of it hit like a cold gust of wind. Who sends a demolition crew to a private cabin without a legitimate order? Who prints fake documents and expects a homeowner to step aside? And why now, when everything seemed quiet and peaceful, when the trust I had in my sanctuary was absolute? I realized that this crew, these trucks, the whole operation, were not just a threat to my property. They were a test, a challenge to see how far they could push someone. I squared my shoulders, letting my calm defiance settle over me. I would not be bullied, deceived, or coerced. Every heartbeat sharpened my awareness. Every breath focused my attention on the discrepancies, the lies, the audacity. I knew that standing still was not an option. The moment demanded action, clarity, and courage. And in that instant, with bulldozers looming and men waiting for orders that had no lawful basis, I understood that what was unfolding was more than a demolition attempt. It was the opening act of a confrontation with authority itself, one I was determined to survive, to expose, and ultimately, to win. As I examined the documents in my hands, a pattern began to emerge, subtle but undeniable. The seals were crude imitations, the fonts inconsistent, and the paper quality suspiciously cheap for anything claiming governmental authority. Each discrepancy felt like a breadcrumb leading me down a path I had not anticipated. A path that suggested this was no simple misunderstanding or overzealous neighbor complaint. Who prints official-looking papers with fake logos and expects a homeowner to comply without question? The thought alone sent a chill down my spine, but it also ignited a spark of clarity. I wasn't just facing a demolition crew. I was staring into a carefully orchestrated web of intimidation, a system designed to exploit trust and fear. I began digging into the HOA's history, leafing through letters, fines, and notices that had accumulated over the past 2 years. Each letter, ostensibly about violations or unpaid fees, revealed a troubling pattern. Minor infractions magnified into crises, arbitrary deadlines imposed with rigid inflexibility, and threats of severe consequences that were never grounded in county law or regulation. Mailings arrived with urgent language and official-sounding terms, deliberately engineered to create anxiety and compliance. Every document, every envelope, every signature hinted at a sophisticated strategy to maintain control through fear. And as I pieced together the chronology, it became clear that this wasn't harassment on a whim. It was a systematic campaign. One person pulling strings from behind the veil of authority. That person became apparent quickly: the HOA president, a woman named Valerie Pierce. Her reputation, carefully maintained in newsletters and community meetings as a model enforcer of neighborhood standards, now carried an undertone of menace. I recalled past encounters where her tone had shifted from cordial to cold in response to minor questions. The fines she levied often targeted new homeowners or residents less likely to push back, yet she presented herself publicly as a guardian of property values and community integrity. The contrast was stark. What appeared to be civic diligence on the surface was actually coercion, an exercise in power wielded through intimidation. Each interaction, each memo, each supposedly routine inspection now read as a calculated move within a larger game I was only beginning to comprehend. As I reviewed more files, patterns connected beyond my own experience. Complaints surfaced about other homeowners, tales of threatened demolitions, sudden property liens, and bizarre citations for minor landscaping infractions. The HOA's reach was broad, its tactics consistent, and its ambition audacious. I realized that my cabin, perched on its mountain, was just one node in a network of control, a testing ground for enforcement techniques that preyed on fear, compliance, and isolation. And yet, instead of succumbing to panic, I felt a surge of determination. Knowledge was my tool. Observation was my shield. Each irregularity I discovered, every past misstep I documented, became evidence that would later illuminate the true nature of this organization. Curiosity became a compass. I began asking questions strategically, tracing patterns in past letters, cross-referencing dates and signatures, and noting inconsistencies that would have gone unnoticed by a casual observer. How could someone operate with such audacity without facing consequences? Were there accomplices? Did the HOA president rely on fear alone, or had she constructed a small bureaucracy of willing enablers? These questions drove me to think, to map, to anticipate the next move. Every answer revealed layers of premeditation, but it also showed my own leverage. I was no longer merely a target. I was an investigator, a strategist, a homeowner empowered by knowledge. The stakes were high, but so too was my resolve. And in that quiet, tense analysis, I realized that this confrontation wasn't just about a cabin. It was about exposing a system built on intimidation and reclaiming the authority that had always belonged to me. Just as the tension reached its peak, a sound behind me drew my attention, a soft crunch of tires on gravel, followed by the unmistakable presence of neighbors who had arrived quietly but decisively. One by one, familiar faces emerged from the trees lining the road. Mrs. Thompson in her Honda Civic, Mr. Alvarez walking with his camera, and others carrying smartphones and tablets, each device ready to document the unfolding scene. There was a collective understanding in their eyes, a shared recognition that what was happening went beyond a single cabin or a single homeowner. In that moment, the isolation I had felt, the sense that I was facing an immense, faceless authority alone, began to dissolve. The solidarity was palpable, a shield of human presence that carried its own weight of moral authority. Mrs. Thompson positioned her car sideways behind one of the trucks, effectively creating a barrier that forced the crew to pause. She stepped out, phone in hand, capturing every movement, every line of dialogue, and even the brief, uncertain expressions flickering across the foreman's face. I could see the realization settle over him and his team. This was no longer a private confrontation. Their actions were being witnessed, recorded, and preserved. The audacity that had brought them here suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable to scrutiny far beyond their expectations. Every moment they hesitated, every glance they exchanged, built suspense not just for me, but for the growing audience who, like the neighbors, would witness this challenge to illegitimate authority. The crowd grew incrementally as word spread through the mountain community. A few residents drove up, cameras at the ready, while others arrived on foot, asking questions, offering support, and quietly but firmly asserting their presence. Each person who arrived added another layer of social proof, validating that standing up to this intimidation was not only justified, but necessary. With every additional witness, the crew's confidence wavered, the heaviness of their mission undermined by the unexpected weight of collective human scrutiny. They had anticipated fear, compliance, and isolation, but what they faced now was the exact opposite, courage amplified by unity. I felt a shift within myself as well. The power of knowledge had been my initial armor, but this manifestation of community, became something greater. It was a force that could not be ignored or dismissed. The fear that had momentarily gripped me began to transform into clarity and determination. Could a collection of concerned neighbors actually prevent a demolition crew from acting? Could the simple act of documenting, standing firm, and refusing to be intimidated tip the balance of power? As I observed their movements, the cohesion of the group, and the evident frustration on the foreman's face, I understood that authority, no matter how falsely claimed, is fragile when confronted with principled resistance. In that charged atmosphere, a realization crystallized. We were no longer merely witnesses to an unfolding act of aggression. We were participants in a living, breathing assertion of justice. Each recorded motion, each upright stance, each questioning gaze became a thread in a larger narrative, a story of community standing for what is right, of ordinary people confronting overreach, and of the invisible but undeniable strength that emerges when solidarity replaces isolation. And in that moment, amid the rumble of idling trucks and the murmurs of allies, I felt a quiet but profound empowerment. The knowledge that together, we could resist, expose, and ultimately overcome an audacious attempt at unlawful authority. The day of the HOA board meeting arrived with a tension that felt almost physical, a tightness in my chest that mingled anticipation with the weight of responsibility. I walked into the room, the familiar scent of varnish and recycled air filling my senses, and took a seat in the front row, placing the recording device on the polished table before me. Around me, the board members were shuffling papers, exchanging polite nods that barely masked the undercurrent of unease. And there, at the head of the table, sat Valerie Pierce, the HOA president whose carefully curated authority had suddenly begun to unravel in the wake of my documented evidence. Her posture was rigid, her smile tight, an attempt at control that already felt precarious. The moment had arrived to confront the person who had orchestrated intimidation and deception against not just me, but potentially every homeowner who had trusted her office. I began calmly, my voice measured but resolute. "I want to play a recording of actions taken against my property yesterday," I said, placing the first clip on the speaker. The room grew quiet. The sound of trucks, voices issuing commands, and the unmistakable directive to demolish my cabin filled the space. Eyes widened around the table. Valerie's face remained carefully composed, but her fingers tapped nervously against the table, betraying the veneer of authority she tried to project. "Can you explain why a demolition crew was sent to my property under pretenses?" I asked, letting the question hang in the charged silence. Every board member shifted, some leaning forward, others glancing at one another, the weight of accountability settling slowly into the room. She opened her mouth, attempting a casual dismissal. "There was confusion in the paperwork," she said, voice smooth but lacking conviction. "We were following procedures as advised by our counsel." Her words, meant to deflect, only heightened the tension. I pressed on, carefully laying out the discrepancies. The non-existent agency, the fake seals, the poor quality of the documents, and the obvious orchestration of a plan designed to intimidate. Each point was met with a mixture of shock and recognition. Faces around the table shifted from polite neutrality to subtle alarm, a silent acknowledgement that the situation was far graver than previously understood. The imbalance of power she had relied upon for years was slipping, and I could see it. I let the recording play again, this time highlighting her instructions to the foreman: "Finish the job, or you don't get paid." The words echoed in the boardroom, and for the first time I noticed murmurs from the members. One long-serving board member cleared his throat, leaning forward. "Ms. Pierce," he said carefully, "can you confirm you authorized demolition under false authority?" The question, simple yet piercing, punctured the protective bubble she had created around herself. Her eyes flicked between the recording device and the members, searching for an escape, a justification that did not exist. None was forthcoming. I watched as credibility collapsed in real time. The board's initial defensiveness gave way to the recognition of legal exposure, ethical failure, and public scrutiny. Valerie attempted to justify her actions by invoking property value protection, neighborhood standards, and vague procedural mandates. Still, the logic was brittle under the weight of evidence. Each defense she offered only reinforced the narrative of coercion and manipulation. The room's energy shifted. Curiosity and suspense blended with moral reckoning. Could someone who wielded authority so recklessly be held accountable? Would justice prevail in a system she had assumed would protect her? The turning point crystallized as a motion for accountability emerged from an unlikely voice, a quiet, diligent member who had rarely spoken during meetings. "We need to vote on whether she remains in her position," he said. Heads nodded, murmurs spread, and the room braced as ballots were cast. The vote was unanimous. Valerie's chair at the head of the table became symbolic, a throne stripped of legitimacy. The collapse of her authority was complete, a tangible, almost cinematic shift that left the room vibrating with relief and restrained triumph. Watching a carefully maintained facade of power crumble under the weight of truth, transparency, and community solidarity was a lesson in justice unfolding before my eyes. The confrontation was more than a personal victory. It was a reaffirmation of principle, demonstrating that even entrenched authority can be challenged and held accountable when knowledge, courage, and evidence converge. The immediate aftermath of the boardroom confrontation left an undeniable ripple through the community. Valerie Pierce, once the unchallenged authority of the HOA, now faced scrutiny that went far beyond neighborhood gossip. The recordings I had meticulously captured became more than evidence of audacity. They were proof of a deliberate, unlawful attempt to intimidate and demolish private property. Within hours, word spread, and legal counsel began to circle, each step ratcheting the stakes higher. I watched as the facade of control that Pierce had carefully curated began to crack under the weight of reality, a weight that no amount of charm, rhetoric, or procedural jargon could withstand. Every phone call, every email from attorneys, and every inquiry from county officials reminded her that authority without accountability is fragile. and exposure can strike with sudden force. The involvement of local authorities transformed suspicion into a formal investigation. Deputies and inspectors reviewed the recordings, the forged documents, and the chain of communications that revealed a pattern of deliberate intimidation. I could see the shift in the HOA's internal calculations. What had once seemed like an untouchable position was now contingent on legal interpretation and public record. Watching trained professionals dissect the situation, validate my observations, and take definitive steps toward accountability created a sense of empowerment that went beyond personal vindication. The machinery of justice, slow and deliberate though it often is, moved with a clarity and precision that reassured me that the truth could not be ignored. As the investigation progressed, broader implications came into focus. Valerie's actions were not isolated incidents. They mirrored stories I uncovered from other homeowners who had quietly endured threats, fines, or harassment for questioning authority. Vulnerable populations, new residents, elderly homeowners, and those less familiar with legal protections, had been targeted systematically, a discovery that intensified my sense of purpose. The situation now extended beyond a personal dispute. It was a fight to expose structural abuse, to illuminate a pattern that had allowed fear to substitute for oversight, and to prevent others from becoming victims of the same audacity. The moral weight of the matter lent urgency to each call, each consultation, and each meeting with authorities. Throughout this period, suspense hung thick in the air. Every report from inspectors, every legal notice, and every preliminary finding carried with it the question, what consequences would Pierce face? Would she attempt to evade responsibility, manipulate procedural loopholes, or intimidate witnesses? The uncertainty amplified the tension, but it also sharpened the clarity of my actions. I had documented everything meticulously, anticipated counter-arguments, and maintained focus on transparency. Every recording, every cross-referenced date, every anomaly in her prior correspondence became leverage in a process designed to transform fear and deception into accountability. The crescendo of validation arrived as attorneys and local regulators confirmed the legitimacy of the claims. The board, already shaken by the public exposure, faced inquiries that could result in civil and criminal consequences. Watching a system that had seemed impervious to individual challenge respond to evidence and procedure underscored a profound lesson. Authority, no matter how entrenched, can be confronted when approached strategically, with patience, and with the courage to document truth. As I observed the legal mechanisms activate, I felt a shift from anxiety to cautious optimism, a transformation rooted in the understanding that systematic overreach cannot withstand scrutiny when it collides with law and reason. Even in these moments, curiosity and suspense persisted. How far would the legal consequences extend? Would others within the HOA be implicated? Could this exposure create broader reforms, safeguards, or protections for homeowners who had previously been powerless? Each development carried weight, and every update echoed a larger truth. Courage paired with evidence can shift the balance of power, even when facing entrenched authority. The sense of relief was tempered by anticipation. This tension reminded me that justice is a process, not a moment. By the end of this period, the contours of resolution began to emerge. Legal scrutiny was no longer a theoretical possibility, but an active reality. The recordings, the testimony of neighbors, and the chain of documented actions ensured that accountability was no longer optional. The narrative of intimidation and impunity was being rewritten as one of oversight, consequence, and empowerment. As the pieces fell into place, I felt a quiet but profound satisfaction, not of vengeance, but of justice being realized, of systems responding to evidence, and of ordinary homeowners witnessing that integrity, courage, and preparation can protect what is rightfully theirs. In that realization, the long shadow of fear lifted, leaving clarity, validation, and hope in its place. Standing on the deck of my cabin, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The air carried the same crisp, grounding quality it always had, yet everything felt altered, charged with the weight of what had passed and the quiet triumph of what had been preserved. This cabin, more than wood and stone, represented resilience, determination, and the tangible proof that confronting audacious authority is possible. Each board, each beam, each window framed not only a personal sanctuary, but a story of courage and vigilance, a testament to the fact that knowledge, preparation, and moral clarity can protect what is rightfully yours. I could feel the energy of the mountain itself, a silent witness to both the threat and the victory, grounding me in the realization that this place would endure because of the choices made in those tense hours. The ordeal had exposed more than just a single HOA president's abuse. It had revealed a pattern of systemic exploitation, tactics designed to intimidate, control, and manipulate homeowners. Yet witnessing the legal scrutiny, the investigation, and the eventual accountability brought a profound lesson. Even entrenched authority is subject to challenge when confronted with truth and courage. The recordings, the witness accounts, the meticulous documentation, they were more than evidence. They were instruments of justice, reminders that power is not absolute and that compliance is not always obligatory. What had begun as an isolated confrontation became a beacon, a signal to others who had quietly suffered under intimidation that standing up is not only possible, it is necessary. Community solidarity had proven itself indispensable. Without the neighbors who arrived unbidden, without the witnesses who recorded, questioned, and asserted presence, the story might have been different. There is a profound lesson in collective action. When individuals unite around principle, fear loses its potency. I reflected on the courage of those who intervened not for personal gain, but out of shared responsibility. I realized that their presence had created a ripple effect, inspiring confidence in those who had felt powerless and reinforcing the idea that accountability is strengthened when people refuse to stand alone in the face of injustice. Their actions reminded me that community is not merely a network of proximity, it is a living system of support, protection, and moral reinforcement. As news of the HOA president's misconduct spread, the story evolved from a local scandal to an emblem of broader significance. Conversations began about protective legislation, accountability mechanisms, and safeguards for homeowners who lacked the resources or awareness to defend themselves. While the cabin had been saved, the implications extended far beyond my property line. It was a moment of empowerment not just for me, but for anyone who has ever faced intimidation masked as authority. Could this incident inspire reform, prevent future abuses, or encourage neighbors to look out for one another? I believed it could, and I felt a responsibility to ensure that the lessons learned here were shared, amplified, and codified. In quiet reflection, I considered the emotional journey of the past weeks, fear tempered by strategic thinking, uncertainty overcome by observation and documentation, isolation transformed into collective action. The ordeal underscored that justice is often a process rather than an instant, and that the choices we make when confronted with audacity define the limits of what is possible. Standing firm requires courage, but it also requires awareness, preparation, and the recognition that allies, sometimes unexpected, are vital. It is in these moments that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary outcomes. Looking out over the valley, I felt a deep sense of closure mingled with vigilance. The cabin stood intact, the HOA president held accountable, and a sense of possibility lingered in the air. The mountain had witnessed not only a confrontation with authority, but also the affirmation that principled resistance, supported by evidence and community, could prevail. I realized that this story at its core is about empowerment, about the courage to protect what matters, and about the enduring value of solidarity. And as the last rays of sunlight painted the peaks in amber and gold, I understood that while threats may arise, the combination of truth, preparation, and community can transform fear into strength, isolation into unity, and challenge into triumph.